The John Denver mystery is finally solved, and it isn't good. For decades, millions of fans have remembered John Denver as the gentle, nature-loving troubadour whose songs like Rocky Mountain High and Take Me Home Country Roads defined an era of American music. His 1997 death in a plane crash seemed a tragic accident, a beloved artist lost while pursuing his passion for flying. But the story we've been told about Denver's final flight omits crucial details that paint a far more troubling picture. Today, we're revealing the uncomfortable truths behind one of music's most sanitized tragedies, facts that challenge everything you thought you knew about Denver's last day. From a dangerously designed aircraft to battles with the FAA, from personal demons to possible intent, the real story of John Denver's fatal crash contains elements that the mainstream media quickly brushed aside in favor of a cleaner, more palatable narrative. These aren't just minor details lost in the fog of time. They're significant factors that completely transform our understanding of how and why one of America's most beloved singers met his end on that October afternoon in 1997. What you're about to learn will forever change how you think about John Denver's final journey. John Denver's death has long been presented as a straightforward tragedy, a skilled pilot encountering unexpected mechanical issues during a routine flight. But this simplified narrative falls apart under closer scrutiny. The real story involves a complex web of factors: questionable aircraft design, regulatory violations, personal struggles, and troubling questions about Denver's state of mind in those final moments. By examining each of these elements, a very different picture emerges, one that suggests Denver's crash wasn't just bad luck, but the culmination of a series of increasingly dangerous choices made by a man whose life had veered far from the wholesome image his fans cherished. Let's uncover the 5 critical aspects of Denver's fatal flight that have been consistently downplayed or ignored. Factors that together solve the mystery of what really happened over Monterey Bay on October 12, 1997. 1. The plane he flew shouldn't have been airborne. When investigators pulled the wreckage of John Denver's aircraft from the waters of Monterey Bay, they quickly identified the make and model, a Rutan Long EZ, an experimental home-built aircraft that Denver had purchased secondhand just weeks before his fatal crash. This wasn't a standard factory-built plane with rigorous quality controls and extensive safety testing. It was essentially a kit plane assembled by a previous owner, a craft that came with unique handling characteristics and specific operational quirks that would challenge even experienced pilots. What made the Long EZ particularly problematic wasn't just its experimental status, but a specific design flaw that would prove catastrophic for Denver. Unlike standard aircraft where the fuel selector valve is positioned within easy reach of the pilot, the Long EZ that Denver was flying had its valve located behind the pilot's left shoulder, a position that required the pilot to completely take their attention away from flying the aircraft and physically contort their body to operate it. This awkward positioning wasn't a standard feature of all Long EZ'd aircraft, but a modification specific to Denver's plane. The original builder had deviated from Rutan's blueprints when placing the fuel selector valve, creating a uniquely dangerous configuration. For a pilot to switch fuel tanks mid-flight in this aircraft, they would need to release the controls with one hand, twist their upper body nearly 180 degrees backward, locate the valve by feel since it wasn't visible from the cockpit, and then turn it to the correct position, all while maintaining control of the aircraft with their other hand. FAA investigators determined that this deadly design flaw likely played a central role in the crash. Denver had taken off with fuel in the right tank, but apparently ran low during the flight. When attempting to switch to the left tank, he would have had to perform the dangerous contortion required to reach the valve. In those critical moments of divided attention and physical twisting, he appears to have lost control of the aircraft, sending it into the fatal dive from which he couldn't recover. He died trying to twist his body mid-flight in a plane that should have never cleared takeoff, noted one aviation expert familiar with the investigation. This assessment captures a crucial truth. Denver's aircraft represented a perfect storm of dangerous design choices that created an accident waiting to happen. What makes this aspect of the tragedy particularly disturbing is that the plane had undergone an inspection just before Denver purchased it, yet this critical safety issue wasn't flagged as a serious concern. The awkwardly positioned fuel selector valve represented a modification that deviated from the original design specifications, a change that significantly increased the risk during a critical operation that every pilot must perform regularly. For a pilot of Denver's experience level, with documented issues maintaining focus and following protocols, this particular aircraft represented an especially dangerous match. The plane demanded precision, presence of mind, and strict adherence to operational procedures, qualities that, as we'll see, Denver's personal circumstances had compromised in the months leading up to the crash. 2. He wasn't legally allowed to fly that day. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of Denver's fatal flight is a simple fact that received surprisingly little attention in media coverage. John Denver had no legal right to be piloting any aircraft that day. His medical certificate, a requirement for all pilots that certifies they are physically and mentally fit to fly, had been revoked by the Federal Aviation Administration months earlier, effectively suspending his pilot's license. This suspension wasn't a mere technicality or administrative oversight. It stemmed from Denver's increasingly concerning pattern of alcohol-related incidents, including multiple arrests for driving under the influence. In 1993 and 1994, Denver had been arrested twice for drunk driving in Colorado. Then in August 1997, just 2 months before the crash, he was arrested again for DUI, adding to the FAA's concerns about his fitness to operate aircraft. The Federal Aviation Administration takes alcohol violations extremely seriously when evaluating pilots, as even off-duty incidents demonstrate potential judgment issues that could affect flight safety. Each of Denver's DUI arrests triggered automatic reporting to the FAA, creating a documented pattern that regulators could not ignore. By the time of his fatal flight, Denver had been explicitly warned not to operate aircraft until his medical certificate was reinstated, a process that would have required him to demonstrate sobriety and undergo evaluation. Yet on October 12, 1997, Denver simply ignored these restrictions. He drove to Monterey Airport, prepared his recently purchased Long-EZ aircraft, and took off, all without legal authorization to fly. No one at the airport verified his pilot status or questioned his right to operate the aircraft. The system designed to keep unsafe pilots grounded had failed completely. He got in the cockpit anyway, and the system didn't stop him, noted one aviation safety expert who studied the case. This observation highlights a troubling reality. The honor system that largely governs private aviation proved wholly inadequate in preventing a pilot with known issues from taking flight. What makes this aspect particularly disturbing is how it reflects Denver's state of mind in his final months. The decision to fly without proper authorization wasn't a minor oversight, but a deliberate choice to ignore serious safety regulations specifically designed to prevent impaired or unfit pilots from endangering themselves and others. This pattern of disregarding rules extended beyond just flying without proper certification. Investigators would later discover that Denver had failed to perform the required pre-flight fuel check, hadn't properly calculated his fuel needs for the planned flight, and neglected to review the aircraft's operating manual despite being relatively unfamiliar with this specific plane. Each of these omissions represented another link in a chain of poor decisions that culminated in the fatal crash. For fans who cherish Denver's image as a thoughtful, nature-loving ambassador for environmental responsibility, the reality of his final years presents a troubling contradiction. The man who sang about the wisdom of mountains and the sanctity of wilderness was repeatedly demonstrating dangerous lapses in judgment that put both himself and potentially others at risk. A stark contrast to the careful stewardship he advocated in his music. 3. He was battling depression, divorce, and career collapse. Behind John Denver's public image of mountain-fresh optimism and gentle spirituality, his personal life had been unraveling for years before the crash. By 1997, the gap between Denver's sunny musical persona and his private reality had grown into a chasm that few fans fully appreciated. Perhaps the most significant blow came from the dissolution of his second marriage to Australian actress Cassandra Delaney. Their divorce in 1991 had been bitter and public, with Denver openly admitting in interviews that the failure of this relationship had devastated him emotionally. The divorce settlement also created significant financial strain, coming at a time when Denver's commercial relevance was already fading. By the mid-1990s, the artist who had once dominated the charts with multiple platinum albums was struggling to maintain his musical career. Major record labels had lost interest as musical tastes shifted, and Denver found himself increasingly viewed as a relic of an earlier, more innocent era. His once revolutionary blend of folk, country, and pop had fallen out of fashion, and younger audiences often treated his earnest, nature-loving image as something to mock rather than admire. This career decline hit Denver particularly hard because his identity was so thoroughly intertwined with his music and public persona. Friends reported that he struggled with feeling irrelevant and forgotten, a painful transition for someone who had once filled stadiums and influenced American culture so profoundly. Financial pressures added to this emotional burden. While Denver had earned millions during his peak years, expensive divorces, lavish spending habits, and declining income had created genuine concern about his long-term financial security. He had begun selling properties and assets to maintain his lifestyle, creating additional stress during an already difficult period. Most concerning were reports from those closest to Denver about his emotional state in the months before his death. Multiple friends described him as showing signs of clinical depression, withdrawing socially, losing interest in activities he once enjoyed, and expressing feelings of hopelessness about his future. This psychological distress appears to have been largely hidden from his fan base, who continued to see only the smiling, positive figure Denver presented in his increasingly rare public appearances. He was everyone's sunshine, but his final years were storm clouds and silence, observed one longtime friend who requested anonymity. This poignant assessment captures the painful contradiction between Denver's public image and private reality, a man known for spreading joy while privately struggling with profound sadness and isolation. Denver's attempts to reinvent himself in the 1990s revealed both his resilience and desperation. He pursued humanitarian work, environmental activism, and space advocacy, worthy causes that nonetheless failed to reignite public interest in his career. Each new project seemed to fall short of recapturing the cultural relevance he once commanded so effortlessly. These personal and professional struggles create an essential context for understanding Denver's state of mind on the day of his fatal flight. He wasn't the carefree nature lover of his musical persona, but a troubled man facing the collapse of his career, financial uncertainty, emotional isolation, and the loss of the public adoration that had once defined his life. These circumstances don't just add poignancy to the tragedy, they potentially transform our understanding of the choices he made on that final day. 4. Some believe it wasn't an accident at all. Among the most disturbing aspects of the John Denver mystery are the questions raised by those closest to him about whether the crash was truly an accident. While the official NTSB investigation ruled the crash accidental, citing the awkwardly positioned fuel selector and Denver's probable loss of control while attempting to switch tanks, several troubling factors have led some to question whether something more deliberate might have been involved. The timing of Denver's fatal flight raises the first red flag. Just weeks before the crash, Denver had been formally denied reinstatement of his medical certificate by the FAA, effectively grounding him from legal flight for the foreseeable future. For a man who had described flying as the second greatest thrill known to mankind, with the first being sex, this loss would have represented another devastating blow on top of his professional and personal struggles. Several of Denver's friends, speaking on condition of anonymity out of respect for his legacy, have expressed concerns about his mental state in the days leading up to the crash. One particularly troubling account comes from a fellow pilot who claims Denver had made comments about flying being the only freedom I have left, and questioning, what's the point of being careful anymore just days before the fatal flight? The manner of the flight itself has raised questions among aviation experts. Denver took off without conducting standard pre-flight checks, did not file a formal flight plan, and appeared to be flying without clear purpose. Behaviors inconsistent with responsible piloting, but potentially consistent with someone in a reckless or fatalistic state of mind. The fact that he chose to fly an experimental aircraft he was still unfamiliar with, despite not being legally certified to fly at all, suggests a disregard for safety that some see as potentially deliberate. He'd lost control of his life, and maybe, just maybe, the plane too, suggested one longtime associate who had known Denver throughout his career. This carefully worded assessment hints at what some close to Denver have privately wondered, whether his final flight might have represented not just negligence, but a conscious decision to take one last risk with full awareness of the potential consequences. It's important to emphasize that there is no definitive evidence that Denver intentionally crashed his aircraft. The official investigation found no mechanical failures that would have made the crash inevitable, and the most likely scenario remains that Denver lost control while attempting to switch fuel tanks. However, the constellation of factors surrounding the crash, his emotional state, recent FAA rejection, pattern of increasingly reckless behavior, and the preventable nature of the accident have left lingering questions that the official investigation did not fully address. These questions are particularly troubling when viewed alongside Denver's own lyrics, which often touched on themes of freedom, flying, and escaping earthly constraints. Songs like Fly Away and Looking for Space take on haunting new dimensions when considered in light of his final flight. While it would be inappropriate to assert that Denver's crash was definitively intentional, it would be equally incomplete to dismiss the possibility that his state of mind may have contributed to risk-taking that made the accident more likely or even welcome. The mystery of Denver's final moments, what he was thinking as he struggled with the aircraft over Monterey Bay, remains one that neither investigators nor those who loved him can fully resolve. This ambiguity adds another layer of tragedy to a death that already robbed the world of one of its most distinctive musical voices. 5. The media sanitized the story. Perhaps the most significant factor in the John Denver mystery is how thoroughly the media sanitized the circumstances of his death, creating a narrative that better aligned with his wholesome public image rather than the complex, troubled reality of his final years. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, news coverage focused almost exclusively on Denver's musical legacy, his environmental activism, and the tragic irony of a nature lover dying while enjoying the freedom of flight. Major outlets produced retrospectives, celebrating his contributions to American music and culture, with only passing mentions of the circumstances of the crash itself. What was noticeably absent from most coverage were the troubling factors that had preceded the accident. Denver's multiple DUI arrests, his suspended pilot's license, his financial and career struggles, and the questions about his emotional state in those final months. When these elements were mentioned at all, they were typically relegated to brief notes far down in articles or buried in the final minutes of broadcast segments. This selective reporting wasn't just a matter of respecting the dead, it represented a deliberate choice to present a simplified version of events that wouldn't tarnish the legacy of a beloved cultural figure. The result was a public understanding of Denver's death that bore little resemblance to the complicated reality. They gave us the peace version. The truth was much messier, noted one journalist who covered music during Denver's era. This observation captures how thoroughly the media shaped the public narrative around Denver's death, emphasizing what fit with his established image while minimizing or omitting elements that contradicted it. The sanitization extended to discussions of the crash investigation itself. While aviation publications and specialized outlets explored the technical details, including the problematic fuel selector placement and Denver's lack of proper certification, mainstream sources typically described the crash in vaguer terms as a tragic accident, without delving into the specific factors that made it both preventable and potentially tied to Denver's personal struggles. Even the numerous books and documentaries about Denver's life produced in the years following his death have often maintained this selective approach, celebrating his musical and humanitarian achievements while treating his final years and the circumstances of the crash as minor footnotes rather than integral parts of his story. This media handling of Denver's death raises important questions about how we remember public figures and whether the full truth serves the public better than comforting narratives. By sanitizing the circumstances of Denver's crash, media outlets may have preserved a more positive legacy, but they also missed an opportunity to discuss important issues around mental health, addiction, and the consequences of reckless behavior, discussions that might have created greater awareness and potentially helped others facing similar struggles. For the millions who grew up with Denver's music and still find comfort in his gentle, nature-loving persona, the full story of his final flight doesn't diminish his artistic contributions or the genuine positive impact he had on American culture. Rather, it completes our understanding of a complex human being who, like all of us, contained contradictions and struggles beneath his public image. A man whose songs celebrated the beauty of life even as he wrestled with his own demons. The final minutes. When we integrate all 5 aspects of the John Denver mystery, a clearer picture emerges of what likely happened in those final moments over Monterey Bay. Denver took off in an aircraft he was still learning to operate without legal authorization to fly and without performing proper pre-flight checks. At some point during the flight, he needed to switch fuel tanks, a routine operation made dangerous by the experimental aircraft's poorly positioned selector valve. As Denver reached behind his shoulder to access this valve, he would have needed to take his attention away from flying the aircraft and physically twist his body in the confined cockpit. This distraction and awkward positioning, combined with his possible emotional distress and documented history of poor judgment, created a perfect storm of factors that led to the fatal loss of control. Whether this sequence represents a tragic accident born of negligence or something more deliberate remains an unanswerable question. What is clear is that Denver's death resulted not from a single mistake or mechanical failure, but from a complex intersection of personal choices, design flaws, regulatory failures, and psychological factors. A confluence of circumstances far more complicated than the sanitized narrative initially presented to the public. John Denver's final flight reveals a truth far more complex than the simple accident story we've been told for decades. Behind the crash that took his life lay a troubling combination of factors: a dangerously designed aircraft, a pilot flying without legal authorization, personal demons that may have clouded his judgment, and questions about his intentions that remain unanswered. While none of these revelations diminish Denver's musical legacy or the joy his songs brought to millions, they complete our understanding of the man behind the music, a flawed, struggling human being whose tragic end contained layers of meaning that deserve to be acknowledged rather than sanitized away. The mystery of what really happened that October day isn't good news for those who prefer simple narratives, but it offers something more valuable: the truth.